Magic the Gathering is a game that appeals to a wide variety of players, but we all start at the same point. Over time, we improve, but what steps can we take to really reach that next level? Today, I want to talk about getting better at Magic the Gathering. If that sounds interesting, pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. So before we start talking about how we can get better as players, I think it's important to establish what the different levels are in which players exist. I think we, as players of Magic the Gathering, me included, are bad judges of how experienced we actually are with the game. I know people that have been playing for 15, 20 plus years that don't fully understand the core rules of the game. And I know other people that have been playing for only 6 months that are ready to go pro. So I don't think it's really tied to experience in that way. So instead of approaching this as saying beginner, intermediate, advanced, I want to approach this from sort of a range of influence perspective. At the lowest level, you have players that know the rules of the game. They don't need to know the intricacies of the layers or the stack or all of these other ancillary parts of the game, but just the core how to play the game rules of Magic the Gathering. Once they've mastered that and understand the general flow of play, I think the next level would be understanding your deck. Knowing what the cards in your deck do, knowing how you're trying to win, and generally knowing how to approach the game with your deck. When you fire off a tutor, you should have a couple cards in mind that you're searching for. Once you've mastered your deck, I think the next step is understanding your opponent's deck. And this can be specific. I know that Jack always plays mono black, and I know what cards he plays. I know what his win conditions are, and I've seen how it works in the middle of a game. Maybe I know that Jamie always plays that Infect deck. You know, it's really scary, it's a modern deck, and it's a problem. But I know how to counter it. I've played against it multiple times. Maybe I know that there are certain decks in Standard that are problems for me. And as we start to piece this together, we reach the next level, which is understanding decks in the abstract, knowing what specific archetypes do, knowing what specific commanders are trying to accomplish, and knowing when someone is explaining a strategy to you, ways of building that deck yourself. Now you're building a library of cards and decks and seeing how they work together. And over time, that brings you to the last level, which is understanding the broader landscapes of decks, understanding how cards work together and how different decks interact to create any given metagame. But beyond that, understanding how you can build a deck that fits into that metagame. Maybe you find that people are running a lot of control decks, and they're all trying to make the game go super long. And so you build a deck that gets under that, goes aggro, really fast, tempo-based, and you can crush the metagame. Or maybe you know that people are getting really involved in graveyard strategies, and so you put together a sideboard that allows you to really punish those specific types of decks. At that point, you're at the final stage of getting better at Magic. You know how everything interacts. You can see the code behind the screen, and you've mastered the game. Anything beyond that is theory crafting, looking at new releases and immediately knowing how they fit in. We'll get to that later. But for now, let's back up and talk about when we first get started, when we only know the rules of Magic the Gathering. How do we get better? So when you were just starting with Magic the Gathering, whether you started with a starter deck that looks like this for Commander, or a dual deck that looks like this to play with your partner, or maybe you started off with an old tournament pack, or booster packs with a random assortment of cards and you choose to build your own deck, or you have somebody help you build your own deck. Your first step is getting to know the game, understanding the rules, and mastering the general flow of your turn and things that you can do during your opponent's turn. Each one of these steps for getting better at the game, I'm going to break into 3 parts. What you can do before the game, during the game, and after the game. And to be clear, after you've played your first game of Magic, that after the game and before the game kind of blend in together. Because every period of time when you're not playing Magic is both before your next game and after your last game. So instead, I want to look at the after the game as being just the couple minutes or hours after you finish a game, and the before the game being the entire span of time between games in which you improve your deck and learn new things about the game. So as a new player, what should you do before a game? Don't worry about it. Worry about scheduling. Line up times that you can play with friends. During a game, I want you to focus only on the cards that are in your hand. Don't worry about the rest of your deck. Don't worry about what your opponent is doing. Just understand the cards that you are currently holding and their impact on the game itself. During your opponent's turn, be thinking about what you want to do on your turn, or ways that you can interact with the cards that your opponent is playing. Only those cards in your hand and on your field in front of you. And then after the game, again, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. Win or lose, you learned a little bit more about your cards, you probably have a better grasp on the game, and you can just get ready for the next one. At some point, you probably need to think about whether you enjoy playing the deck that you are currently using. Maybe you want to explore some other archetypes. Try out some other decks. And I gotta say, one of the big benefits of the Magic the Gathering community is people have so many cards. Just an unimaginable amount of cards. Ask to borrow someone's deck. Ask if they can spot you a few cards to try out. Or just proxy it yourself. Write down what a card does, throw it in a sleeve, and try it out. See if you enjoy it. There's a million different ways to engage with the game of Magic, and once you find a deck that's right for you, you can play that deck over and over and love it every time. And when it starts to get old, you're ready to move on to the next step. When you understand what your deck does, the ins and outs, every card that's in there, the go-to cards from tutors, the perfect ways to end the game, the ways to respond to different threats on the table, congratulations, you graduated. And you can move on to the next step. And once you're at that next step, what should you do to get better? Well, again, it begins with what you do before the game. And before the game, when you know your deck, it involves tailoring. Finding the cards that didn't work last time and replacing those with cards you think might next time. Looking at the sets that have rotated in and been released recently, and the sets that have rotated out and are no longer in the format. And removing those cards, bringing in new things, and keeping your deck fresh. But beyond that, keeping your deck interesting for you. And sometimes that involves building a whole new deck. And you might have to start over, but I promise it's faster the second time. Getting a handle on every new deck becomes easier and easier. So then during a game, what should you do to get better? Well, every time you face a new opponent, they're going to deploy new threats. They're going to have new strategies and new cards and new decks entirely. And at this point, you should start thinking about the different ways that you can approach each game. And as you start to see some of these opponents' decks over and over, you get a feel for the ways to counter them, the cards that are good, the cards that aren't. And again, you can use those before the next game to tailor your deck a little bit better. Start leaning into the metagame. Start learning about ways that you can approach the game against each opponent that you have. And finally, what to do after the game to get better. When you know your deck and you're starting to get the hang of the decks that your opponents are using, after each game, think back on why that game ended the way that it did. What happened, win or lose, to close out the game? Did you get overwhelmed with an army of small creatures? Did your opponent have a combo you hadn't seen before? Did you play cards from your deck in a strange sequence that was new to you? Or did everything go exactly as planned and you finished the game the exact way you wanted it to? All of these are important data points to move forward into tailoring your deck to play against different opponents and understand their deck a little bit better. Once you have that interaction understood, knowing what your deck does, what your opponent's decks can do, and understanding how to make adjustments to your deck to make the games more interesting or more angled in your favor if you're a competitive player, you're ready to move on to the next step. So now you know what your deck does, and you know what your opponent's decks do. How do you move to the next level? And ultimately, I think this is the biggest step that we take as Magic the Gathering players. I think a lot of people are very comfortable with the deck that they've crafted and are very comfortable with knowing all of the ins and outs, knowing the cards that are included, knowing exactly how to play it against the opponents that they typically face, and against new players. They can approximate the right decisions and use their intuitive threat assessment that they've developed over time to get through the game and generally perform pretty well. But I think to get better, we can codify that into the same process that we've used before. What to do before a game, and during a game, and after a game. So before a game, at this point, I think it comes down to research. It comes down to looking at tournament results. It comes down to looking at new card previews. It comes down to Discord servers and conversations and playtesting. Trying out different ways to put cards together to make new strategies and find new ways of playing the game. This cannot be exhaustive. There's too many cards to count and too many possible combinations to understand them all. But with a little practice, I think we can get better at knowing which cards should be included in a given deck and which cards shouldn't, what direction the metagame is progressing, which cards are rotating out, which cards are rotating in. And we can theory craft a deck that does what we want it to do in that given metagame. Now, during the game, I think our approach is also a little bit different. We're not just thinking about the cards that we have and the cards that our opponent has, and the things we've seen our opponent's deck perform before. We're thinking about what other strategies that deck could have in it. We're predicting how many counterspells. We're trying to identify how many turns left we have in a given game. Our threat assessment goes beyond what's on the table and in our hands, but to what's in our decks. What possible combinations could be created. And in a commander game where you have 4 decks, that can be a lot. Potentially impossible to think about, but intuitively we get a good feel for it, just with practice. After the game, though, is the single most critical part of getting better at this point. We've reached competitive play. We've reached the point where we want to make our deck the best it can be. And after the game is where we lock that in. We need to think back to the decisions we made during the game, the specific choices that we made that led to that outcome. When we were just learning what our opponent's decks did and what our deck does, we just wanted to think about how the game ended, what led to that end. But now we want to think back further. We need to think back to if we had attacked with that Llanowar Elf on turn 3 because we ended up not using it for mana, how would that have changed the game? Were we 1 damage away? Is this the case that we should have countered something different or held on to that counterspell until we went for our combo win? Whatever choices you make over the course of a game of Magic, immediately after the game is the time to write those down. And I mean, physically, write those down. Have a notebook with you. Identify where you've noticed weaknesses. Because moving forward, you can reference those when you look to update your deck. And if you see one thing happening over and over, out of the last 8 games, 6 of them I had mana troubles in turn 3, it might be time to change the way that your land base functions. Add a few things to ramp out of it. Add other card draw or filter mechanics to get to the lands that you need when you find yourself short. Those choices are critical. And using that result that you have written down after your games helps you to see the connection points between different decks. Identify specific opponents' decks that are problems for yours, and maybe put in some options to deal with them. Either sideboard cards or silver bullets in the main deck. Whatever it happens to be, you can start tailoring your game plan to the greater metagame. Not just what your opponents are playing, but what's good in general. And as you start moving up into higher echelons of tournament play, you're going to start facing a wider audience using cards you've never seen before. And having that intuitive sense and practice against a variety of different decks will help you reach that point. Following that, there's really only one place to go. And that's to the very, very top percentages of competitive play. And reaching that point, that goes a little bit beyond me. I think there's material out there that talks about getting to that point of understanding the entire metagame, how every deck interacts with each other, how to build decks for any situation. But ultimately, we're not a closed system. Humans aren't perfect calculators. There's too many factors to count. And you can get pretty close just by playing a lot of Magic. Just having that experience counts for a lot. So continue to do research, continue to build your decks up, continue to look at what your opponent's decks can do, take notes of how you close out the game and choices your opponent made that might have surprised you. And then try it out. Play more Magic. Try out other formats. I think there's lessons that we can learn in Commander that help us in Legacy. There's lessons we can learn from playing Modern that help us build better Commander decks. I think Magic is an entire ecosystem that all kind of interlaces itself in a really unique way. And no matter what your interest is in the game, there's a spot for you. There's a deck that works for you. There's a way of playing the game that appeals to everybody. So try out some new things. New formats, new strategies. Try taking some steps to reach whatever you want to reach in playing Magic. If that's competitive play, start working at progressing your game plan. Start learning how to be a better player. And if it's just playing casually with friends, I think it helps there too. Understanding how every deck plays and how you can improve your deck to be a little more interesting. Give it a shot. It's been really nice talking to you.